For 7 years, I watched my husband read bedtime stories to a son who wasn't his. I watched him teach bike riding, attend soccer games, and give goodnight kisses to a child born from my betrayal. I thought I'd taken my secret to the grave, until a simple DNA test for a school science project shattered 3 lives forever. I met David when I was 23, working at a marketing firm in downtown Chicago. He was the kind of man who opened doors, remembered your coffee order, and made you feel like the only woman in the room. Tall, with kind brown eyes and this infectious laugh that could turn my worst days around. We were both ambitious, both dreamers, and when he asked me to move in with him after 8 months of dating, I didn't hesitate for a second. Our little apartment on the north side became our sanctuary. David would cook these elaborate Sunday dinners, insisting we needed real family traditions, even though it was just the two of us. He'd talk about our future kids while stirring pasta sauce, describing how he'd teach them to throw a baseball or help with homework at the kitchen table. I loved watching his face light up when he talked about being a father someday. After 2 years together, David proposed on the same corner where we'd had our first date. Nothing fancy, no flash mob or elaborate setup, just him dropping to one knee outside that little coffee shop, nervous as hell, asking if I wanted to build a life with him. Of course I said yes. How could I not? He was everything I thought I wanted in a husband, steady, loyal, completely devoted to me. We had this perfect wedding in his hometown, small and intimate, surrounded by family and friends, who kept telling us we were meant to be. His mother pulled me aside during the reception, tears in her eyes, saying she'd never seen her son so happy. I felt like the luckiest woman alive, dancing with my new husband under string lights in his childhood backyard. The first 3 years of marriage were exactly what you'd expect from two people madly in love. We bought our first house, a charming little colonial, with a white picket fence that David insisted we needed for. When the babies come, he was already planning the nursery, talking about converting the spare bedroom, picking out paint colors. His excitement about starting a family was infectious, and I found myself wanting it just as much as he did. But somewhere around year 4, things started to shift. David got promoted to regional manager, which meant longer hours, more travel, and less time for us. I don't blame him for it now. He was building our future, securing our finances, so I could eventually stay home with kids like we'd planned. But at the time, I felt abandoned. I'd come home to an empty house more nights than not, eating dinner alone, going to bed alone, waking up to hurried kisses goodbye as he rushed off to another meeting. That's when I started going out with my coworkers more often. Happy hour on Fridays turned into dinners on weeknights, and I began building friendships I'd neglected during my early married years. There was this group of us, mostly women from the office, but occasionally we'd be joined by guys from the sales department or other floors. It felt good to laugh again, to feel seen and heard by people who weren't constantly checking their phones or talking about quarterly reports. Marcus was one of those guys from sales. He was everything David wasn't. Spontaneous where David was planned. Rough around the edges where David was polished. Exciting where David was safe. He had this way of making every conversation feel like a secret, every joke like it was meant just for you. When the group would head out for drinks, he'd somehow end up sitting next to me. When we'd all be laughing about something, I'd catch him looking at me instead of whoever was telling the story. I knew it was dangerous. I knew I was walking a line that good wives don't cross. But David was in Portland for 2 weeks on business, and I was lonely, and Marcus had this way of making me feel alive again. It started innocent enough, text messages during the day, complaining about work or sharing funny memes. Then it moved to phone calls on my drive home, conversations that stretched longer than they should have. The night it happened, I'd had too much wine at Janet's birthday party. Marcus offered to drive me home since David was still traveling, and I said yes, even though I knew I shouldn't. We sat in my driveway talking for an hour about everything and nothing, and when he leaned over to kiss me, I didn't stop him. I didn't stop anything that happened after that. It was supposed to be one night. One mistake born from loneliness and too much alcohol. But it wasn't. For 3 months, while David threw himself into work, I threw myself into an affair that made me feel reckless and wanted, completely unlike the dutiful wife I'd become. Marcus would text during David's business trips, show up at my office with coffee, make me feel like I was worth the risk. When I found out I was pregnant, my world collapsed and reassembled itself in the span of a heartbeat. David was over the moon, calling his parents immediately, already researching cribs and car seats. He kept kissing my still flat stomach and talking to the baby, telling him or her about all the adventures they'd have together. All I could think about was counting backwards on the calendar. The first few years with Jackson were blissful chaos. David was the kind of father who got up for every midnight feeding, changed every diaper without complaint, and documented every milestone with the enthusiasm of a professional photographer. He taught Jackson to walk in our living room, celebrated his first words like they were Shakespeare, and read Goodnight Moon so many times he could recite it backwards. I loved watching them together. Jackson would light up whenever David walked into a room, reaching his chubby little arms up to be held. They had this bedtime routine where David would make up these elaborate adventure stories starring Jackson the Brave, complete with different voices for all the characters. Some nights I'd stand in the doorway just watching my husband weave these magical tales for our son. And I'd feel this overwhelming gratitude that we'd made it through those rough patches in our marriage. But as Jackson grew older, subtle differences started emerging that made my stomach clench in ways I tried to ignore. David has these warm brown eyes, the kind that crinkled when he smiles. And I have green eyes with gold flecks that my mother always said were my best feature. Jackson's eyes were neither. They were this striking hazel color, more amber than anything else. And they had this intensity that reminded me of someone I was trying very hard not to think about. When Jackson was 3, David's sister Emma came to visit with her kids. We were all sitting around the dinner table when she made this casual comment that stopped my heart. "It's so funny how genetics work. Jackson looks nothing like either of you. Must take after some distant relative." She said it with a laugh, the way families do when they're trying to solve the puzzle of who a child resembles. David just shrugged it off, saying something about how his grandfather had lighter eyes. But I saw him study Jackson's face a little longer that night during story time. The comments became more frequent as Jackson started school. Other parents would ask if he was adopted, or make jokes about the mailman, the kind of thoughtless comments people make without realizing how they land. David would laugh along, but I started noticing how his jaw would tighten slightly, how he'd change the subject a little too quickly. I told myself I was being paranoid, that plenty of kids don't look like their parents, that genetics are complicated and unpredictable. When Jackson was 5, we went to David's cousin's wedding. The whole extended family was there, and I watched as relatives tried to place who Jackson looked like. His glutton kept insisting he had the family chin, while his uncle swore he could see David's father in Jackson's smile, but I could tell David was getting uncomfortable with all the scrutiny. That night in our hotel room, he was quieter than usual, and when I asked what was wrong, he said something about how weird family genetics conversations always were. The real trouble started when Jackson began playing Little League at 6. David was so proud, signing up to be an assistant coach, buying all the gear, taking Jackson to practice early so they could work on his swing. But Marcus had also signed his son up for the same league. I hadn't seen him in years, had successfully avoided any situation where we might cross paths. But there we were, sitting in the same bleachers, watching our kids play on the same team. The resemblance between Jackson and Marcus's older son Kyle was unmistakable. They had the same amber eyes, the same stubborn cowlick in their hair, the same way of tilting their head when they were concentrating. I felt sick watching them stand next to each other during team photos, praying that no one else would notice what seemed so obvious to me. Marcus noticed too. I could feel him looking at Jackson, then at me, then back at Jackson. After one particularly brutal game where both boys struck out, Marcus approached me by the concession stand while David was talking to the coach. "He's got my eyes," he said quietly, not looking at me directly. "He's got his father's eyes," I replied firmly, my voice steadier than my hands. "We both know who his father is, Rebecca." I walked away without another word, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt that had been buried for 6 years was starting to sprout. I could see it growing in Marcus's face every time he looked at Jackson. David started noticing things too. Little comments would slip out, observations that cut through me like glass. "Funny how Jackson hates baseball, but loves it when he gets a hit, just like that guy Marcus from your old work." Or "Jackson's got this stubborn streak that definitely doesn't come from my side of the family." Each comment felt like a test, like David was fishing for something without knowing exactly what he was looking for. The breaking point came during Jackson's 7th birthday party. We'd invited his whole class, and the house was full of kids running around. Parents making small talk, the usual chaos of a children's party. David was taking pictures of Jackson blowing out his candles when his mother pulled me aside. "You know, dear," she said in that sweet but pointed way mothers-in-law have perfected, "I was looking through old family photos last night, trying to find pictures that looked like Jackson for his baby book. I went through 4 generations of family photos, and I just can't find the resemblance. Not that it matters, of course. Sometimes children just look completely unique. But I could see in her eyes that it did matter. That the questions were starting to form. David's words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I thought I'd extinguished years ago. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was certain he could hear it. For a moment I considered telling him everything right there, confessing to the affair, explaining about Marcus, begging for forgiveness. But then I looked at Jackson's birthday pictures scattered across our bedspread, his gap-toothed grin in frame after frame, and I couldn't do it. "That's ridiculous," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "Why would she even think that?" David shrugged, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "She said something about how genetics work in families, how there's always some resemblance somewhere down the line. She couldn't find any with Jackson. He picked up one of the photos, studying our son's face, like it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Your mom is overthinking things," I said, moving closer to him on the bed, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Jackson looks like Jackson. Not every child has to be a carbon copy of their parents." But David's doubt had been planted, and over the next few weeks I watched it grow like a weed in fertile soil. He started paying attention to things he'd never noticed before, comparing Jackson's habits to his own, studying family photos with new intensity. He'd make these casual comments that felt like tiny daggers. "Jackson's left-handed like my brother Tom. Tom's adopted, so I guess that doesn't count for genetics." Or "It's weird how Jackson can roll his tongue, but neither of us can." The situation got worse when Jackson's second-grade teacher assigned a family tree project. Each child was supposed to interview family members and create a poster showing their heritage, including physical traits that had been passed down through generations. Jackson was so excited about it, asking David endless questions about his grandparents and great-grandparents, comparing eye colors and hair textures with scientific 7-year-old precision. David threw himself into helping with the project, pulling out photo albums I hadn't seen in years, calling relatives to verify details about ancestors Jackson had never met. But with each conversation, each comparison, the lack of resemblance became more obvious. Jackson's amber eyes appeared nowhere in David's family line. His hair, a sandy brown with natural highlights, didn't match any of the dark-haired generations in the family photos. His height predictions, based on family genetics, suggested he'd be shorter than he was already tracking to be. "Maybe he takes after your side," David said one evening, as we worked on the poster together. Jackson was at the kitchen table, carefully gluing photos and drawing connecting lines between relatives. "My dad had dark eyes, and you know my mom's family history is pretty limited," I said, which was true. My mother had been adopted, so we'd always had gaps in our genetic knowledge. It was the perfect excuse, and I clung to it like a life raft. But David wasn't satisfied with gaps anymore. "Maybe we should do one of those DNA tests," he said casually, not looking up from the family photos he was organizing. "You know, those ancestry ones? Could help fill in some blanks for Jackson's project, and it might be fun to see what we learn about your family history." My mouth went dry. "Those tests are expensive," I said, stalling for time while my mind raced through possibilities and consequences. "Not really. They've gotten pretty affordable. Think about it, Rebecca. Wouldn't you want to know about your ancestry, medical history that might affect Jackson? Plus, he's so interested in genetics right now, it could be educational." Jackson looked up from his poster, his amber eyes bright with curiosity. "It's something that can tell you about your family history," David explained, his voice taking on that patient, educational tone he used when Jackson asked complex questions. "It looks at your genes and can tell you where your family came from, and even if you have relatives you don't know about. Can we do it?" "Please," Jackson asked, and I felt the walls closing in around me. "We'll see," I said, but David was already pulling out his phone. "Actually, there's a sale this week," he said, scrolling through some website. "Buy 2, get 1 free. We could all do it together, make it a family project." The next few days were torture. David kept bringing up the DNA tests, researching different companies, reading reviews, asking if I'd thought about which one we should order. I kept deflecting, suggesting we wait until after Jackson's school project was due, claiming I was too busy at work to deal with it, making excuse after excuse. But David had made up his mind, and when he gets focused on something, he doesn't let go easily. It's one of the qualities I'd always loved about him, his determination and follow-through. Now that same determination was pointing toward the destruction of everything I held dear. "I ordered them," he announced one evening, walking through the front door with a package in his hands. "They arrived today." Jackson ran over immediately, fascinated by the official-looking box with its scientific labeling. "Is this the DNA test? Can we do it now?" "Not quite yet, buddy," David said, opening the package and reading through the instructions. "We have to spit in these tubes and send them back to a lab, and we wait a few weeks for results." I watched my husband and son examine the testing kits with growing dread. David was explaining the waiting period felt like slow torture. Every day for 6 weeks, I'd check the mail before David got home, hoping to intercept the results somehow, though I had no plan for what I'd do with them if I found them first. David and Jackson would ask almost daily if the results had arrived yet, treating it like waiting for Christmas morning. I'd smile and make jokes about how slowly labs work, all while feeling like I was living on borrowed time. The results arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was at work when David called. I could hear the excitement in his voice immediately. "They're here," he said. "The DNA results came today." My hands started shaking so hard I had to put down my coffee cup. "Oh, that's great," I managed to say. "I can't wait to see them when I get home. Actually, I was thinking we could open them together tonight after dinner. Make it special for Jackson. Maybe order pizza and make it a family event." "Sure," I said, though the word felt like sawdust in my mouth. "That sounds perfect." I spent the rest of the workday in a fog, going through motions of normalcy while my internal world crumbled. By the time I drove home, I'd run through every possible scenario in my head. Maybe the tests would be inconclusive. Maybe there would be an error. Maybe by some miracle, David really was Jackson's father, and my affair had just been terrible timing with no lasting consequences. But deep down I knew. I'd always known. David had ordered pizza from Jackson's favorite place and set up our dining room table like it was a celebration. He'd even bought a bottle of wine for us, and apple juice for Jackson, complete with the fancy glasses we usually save for holidays. The DNA test results sat in the center of the table in 3 unopened envelopes, like presents waiting to be unwrapped. "This is so exciting," Jackson said, bouncing in his chair. "Do you think we're related to anyone famous?" "Maybe," David said, smiling at our son's enthusiasm. "Your mom might be descended from royalty for all we know." I forced myself to smile and participate in the conversation, but I felt like I was watching the scene from outside my own body. Here was my family, excited about discoveries that were about to destroy us, and I was the only one who knew what was coming. After we finished eating, David ceremoniously picked up the first envelope. "Ladies first," he said, handing me mine. "Want to go together or one at a time? Let's each open our own and share what we find," I suggested, hoping to buy myself a few more seconds of this normal, happy life. I opened my envelope with trembling fingers, scanning the results quickly. Everything looked normal from my side, a typical mix of European ancestry with no surprises. I rattled off percentages of Irish, German, and British heritage, while David opened his results. "Pretty much what I expected," David said, reading through his report. "English, Scottish, bit of Scandinavian, nothing shocking there." He looked up at Jackson, who was struggling with his envelope. "Need help, buddy?" "Got it," Jackson said, finally tearing the paper open. He pulled out the report and handed it to David. "What does mine say?" This was the moment. I watched David's face as he began reading Jackson's results, saw the exact second when confusion replaced excitement. His brow furrowed slightly, and he flipped back to the first page, then forward again, like he was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "That's weird," he said quietly. "What's weird?" Jackson asked, reaching for his report. David held on to it, reading more carefully. I could see his face changing as he processed the information, watched the color drain from his cheeks as understanding began to dawn. "Rebecca," he said, his voice strange and flat. "Look at this." He handed me Jackson's results, and I pretended to read them for the first time. Though every word confirmed what I already knew, Jackson's paternal lineage showed markers that were completely inconsistent with David's family line. Not similar enough to be distant relatives, not close enough to indicate any shared ancestry at all. I don't understand, I said, though we both knew I understood perfectly. David stood up from the table, running his hands through his hair. According to this, Jackson and I aren't related at all, not even distantly related. Jackson looked back and forth between us, picking up on the tension but not understanding its source. What does that mean? David looked at me, and I saw 7 years of trust cracking in his eyes like ice breaking apart. It means, he said slowly, that I'm not Jackson's biological father. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jackson's face scrunched up in confusion, and he looked at me for an explanation that I couldn't give. That can't be right, I said weakly. These tests make mistakes sometimes. Maybe we should do another one. But David was still reading. I could see him putting pieces together that I'd prayed he'd never find. It says here that Jackson has genetic markers consistent with someone of mixed European and Native American ancestry. Neither of us has Native American heritage, Rebecca. Marcus did. His grandmother had been Cherokee, something he'd mentioned during one of our conversations at work. David didn't know that, but he was smart enough to start asking the right questions. There has to be an explanation, I said, but my voice sounded hollow and desperate even to me. David sat back down, but he might as well have been a million miles away. He looked at Jackson, then at me, then back at the papers in his hands. 7 years, he said quietly. I've been raising another man's son for 7 years. Jackson started crying then, not understanding what was happening but sensing that his world was falling apart. I reached for him, but David got there first, pulling our son into his arms despite everything he'd just learned. The silence that followed David's words was deafening. Jackson continued crying in David's arms, confused and scared by the tension he could feel but couldn't understand. I sat frozen in my chair, watching my husband comfort a child he'd just learned wasn't biologically his, and I felt my heart break into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be reassembled. David finally looked up at me over Jackson's head, and the pain in his eyes was unbearable. I need to know who, he said quietly. I need to know who his real father is. I couldn't speak. My throat felt completely closed, like my body was rejecting the words that needed to come out. Jackson, buddy, David said gently, why don't you go watch TV in the living room for a bit? Mom and Dad need to talk about grown-up stuff. Jackson wiped his nose on David's shirt and nodded, still sniffling. Are you guys getting divorced? He asked. The question that every child of fighting parents eventually asks. We're just talking, sweetheart, I managed to say. Go pick a movie to watch. After Jackson left the room, David and I sat in the suffocating quiet of our dining room, surrounded by the remains of what was supposed to be a celebration. The pizza boxes and fancy glasses looked obscene now, party decorations for a funeral. How long? David asked. It was just a few months, I whispered. 3 months, 7 years ago. When you were traveling so much for work. Who? The name stuck in my throat like a physical object. Marcus. For my old job, you met him a couple times at company parties. David's face went white, then red, then white again. Marcus from sales, the guy who coached Jackson's Little League team? I nodded, unable to look at him. Jesus Christ, Rebecca. I shook hands with that man. I talked baseball with him. He's been watching Jackson play, knowing he was his son, and I had no idea. He didn't know either, I said quickly. I mean, not for sure, not until recently, but he suspected. David's voice was getting louder. That's why he was always staring at Jackson during games. That's why he'd make those weird comments about how athletic Jackson was getting. I realized then that David had noticed more than I'd given him credit for. He'd been seeing the signs, filing away the strange moments, probably fighting his own suspicions for months. I ended it as soon as I found out I was pregnant, I said. I chose you. I chose our family. David laughed, but it was the most bitter sound I'd ever heard from him. You chose me? You chose to lie to me for 7 years? You let me fall in love with a child who isn't mine? Let me plan his future, save for his college. Worry about his scraped knees and hurt feelings. You let me be his father while his real father was sitting in the bleachers watching us play house. The truth of his words hit me like physical blows. I had done all of those things. I'd watched David pour his heart and soul into raising Jackson. I'd seen him sacrifice sleep and money and time to be the best father he could be. All while knowing the foundation of that relationship was built on my lie. I never meant for it to happen, I said. I was lonely, and you were always working, and I made a mistake. A mistake. David stood up so abruptly his chair fell backward. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill or burning dinner. This was a choice. Multiple choices every single day for 7 years. He started pacing around the kitchen, running his hands through his hair, and I could see him trying to process 7 years of memories through this new lens. Every bedtime story, he said, more to himself than to me. Every Christmas morning, every birthday party, every time he called me daddy. You watched me love that boy with everything I had, and you knew he wasn't mine. He's yours, I said desperately. You raised him. You love him. DNA doesn't change that. David stopped pacing and looked at me like I'd slapped him. Don't you dare try to minimize this. Yes, I love Jackson. I'll always love Jackson. But you stole 7 years from me, Rebecca. 7 years of truth. You stole them from Marcus too, didn't you? His son has been calling another man daddy while he sits on the sidelines. I hadn't thought about it from Marcus's perspective. Hadn't considered what it must have been like for him to watch Jackson grow up from a distance. To suspect but not know. To see his child bonding with another man. What happens now? I asked. David sat back down heavily, suddenly looking older than his 34 years. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I need to think. I need time to process this. Are you going to leave us? The question hung between us like a challenge. David looked toward the living room where we could hear Jackson laughing at something on TV. The sound of a child who didn't yet understand that his world had just shifted on its axis. I don't know how to stay, David said quietly. But I don't know how to leave him either. He's been my son for 7 years, Rebecca. I've been his dad since he was born. How do I walk away from that? You don't have to walk away from anything, I said. We can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can figure it out. But even as I said the words, I could see in David's face that something fundamental had broken between us. The trust that had taken years to build had been destroyed in the span of a single conversation. I'm going to stay in the guest room tonight, he said. I can't sleep next to you right now. I can't even look at you right now. As David walked toward the stairs, he paused in the doorway. Does Marcus know about the DNA results? The weeks that followed the DNA revelation were the darkest period of my life. David moved into the guest bedroom permanently, and we began the delicate dance of trying to co-parent Jackson while our marriage disintegrated around us. David never stopped being a father to Jackson, never let his anger toward me affect how he treated our son, and somehow that made everything worse. His grace in the face of my betrayal only highlighted what a terrible person I'd been. Jackson knew something was wrong, of course. 7-year-olds are more perceptive than adults give them credit for. He'd ask why Daddy was sleeping in the other room, why Mommy was crying so much, why we couldn't do family movie nights anymore. We told him we were going through a rough patch, that grown-ups sometimes needed space to work through problems, but I could see the confusion and fear in his amber eyes every time he looked at us. The hardest part was watching David struggle with his identity as Jackson's father. He'd been so confident in that role for 7 years, and now every interaction was colored by uncertainty. Should he still discipline Jackson the same way? Did he have the right to make major decisions about Jackson's life? What would happen when Jackson learned the truth? 3 weeks after the DNA results, David made the decision I'd been dreading. I called Marcus, he said one evening after Jackson had gone to bed. I told him about the test results. My stomach dropped. What did he say? What do you think he said? He was shocked, angry. He wants to meet with us to talk about what happens next. The meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop downtown while Jackson was at his friend's birthday party. I hadn't seen Marcus in months, and the years had changed him. Looked older, more serious, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during our affair. When he walked into the coffee shop and saw David and me sitting together, his face cycled through a dozen emotions, before settling on something that looked like resigned determination. I've been wondering for 2 years, Marcus said as he sat down across from us. Ever since that first Little League game when I saw Jackson up close, he looks just like my son Kyle did at that age. David's jaw tightened, so you knew. You suspected he was yours, and you said nothing. I suspected, Marcus corrected, but suspecting and knowing are different things. And what was I supposed to do? Walk up to your wife and demand a paternity test? Destroy a family based on a hunch? Instead, you let me raise your son while you watched from the sidelines, David said, his voice carefully controlled. Marcus looked genuinely pained. I thought about Jackson every day. Wondered what kind of father he had, whether he was happy, whether he knew he was loved. When I saw you with him at those games, saw how much you cared about him, it actually made me feel better. I knew he was in good hands. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult I'd ever experienced. Three adults trying to figure out how to navigate a situation that had no roadmap, no right answers, only various degrees of painful compromise. Marcus wanted to be part of Jackson's life, but he didn't want to traumatize him or destroy the only father-son relationship Jackson had ever known. David wanted to continue being Jackson's dad, but he was struggling with questions about his legal rights and emotional boundaries. Jackson doesn't need to know right now, David said finally. He's too young to understand the complexities of this situation. But eventually, he'll need to know the truth. We agreed that Marcus would gradually become more present in Jackson's life, starting as a family friend. Maybe eventually transitioning to a more parental role as Jackson got older and could better understand the situation. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best solution any of us could come up with. David and I separated that fall. He moved into an apartment across town, but stayed involved in every aspect of Jackson's life. He still came to soccer games, still helped with homework, still read bedtime stories 3 nights a week. To the outside world, we looked like one of those modern divorced couples who put their child first, despite their personal problems. But I knew the truth was more complicated than that. David stayed in Jackson's life because he loved him, but he couldn't stay in mine because he couldn't forgive me. It's not for the affair, which might have been forgivable, but for the 7 years of deception that followed.